All right. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We have a wonderful speaker, Carrie Palmer, who's going to talk to us about how to raise kids in this modern world and ensure that they are being raised in the healthiest way possible, but also combining that with what's realistic, right? And so just a couple bits of housekeeping before we get going, just in case anybody is new to Zoom. We have, if you maximize your screen, you'll notice there is a mute image icon on the bottom left side. And so at that point, you might notice that there's a slash through that, and that just means that you are muted. So if you do have questions, as I am the host, I will mute most of people during the talk. But if you have questions, we can have you utilize the chat function, or today, because we've got a little bit more intimate grouping today, if you do have questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask them in the moment too. And then you'll notice there is a stop video icon right next to the mute button, and that is if you don't want your camera on. We will be recording this today, so if you don't want your beautiful face shown to our replay, then go ahead and hit that view and it'll just show your name. From there, if you scroll across the bottom, you'll get to an icon that says chat. That's going to be probably the most valuable one that we have, in that if you have questions and you don't want to ask them aloud, go ahead and write them in the chat function. As I am your host, I will be checking the chat room in there for any sort of concerns, comments, questions that need to be addressed, and I will funnel them over to Carrie whenever it's a good time. So without further ado, I am Dr. Ellen, and I own MindsetPT with my husband, Jeremy, and we solve pain. And so we get to work with people who have complex medical conditions and work on their musculoskeletal system, improving their ability to move and function without pain. So I am so blessed to share an office with Carrie Palmer. She is the owner and founder of Insight Functional Medicine, and she brings such a beautiful perspective on overall health and definitely some specialty information about the importance of gut health with regards to us as humans. And then today she's going to talk about that with kids. So without further ado, here is the lovely Carrie Palmer.
Thank you so much, Ellen. And I am just as blessed to share space with you. Thank you. I appreciate it. So we are going to talk about, and I'll share my screen here, if that's all right. Oh, can you fix that, Ellen? It's saying it's not letting me.
You should be able to share.
Host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Let me find out for you. I am so sorry, everybody.
No, that's right. In the meantime, I will just say I was telling Ellen this morning, I did some trimming of this lecture. Are we good? I did some trimming of this lecture. Oh, it's still saying it's disabled.
One more time.
Okay. There we go. Perfect. So I was telling Ellen that I did some trimming of this presentation this morning, because as I was running through it again, this is a presentation that I made for a course a year ago, and I recalled when I was racing through it that it was a 90-minute course. So I did some trimming. This is a complex topic though, so I'm going to try to do it justice. There is a lot of information in this lecture, and I'm going to try to do the best job I can to keep it somewhat concise and still fairly comprehensive. But I will say right now, there are going to be a few slides that I'm going to kind of skim through. I intentionally left them in there though, so if anyone wants to look over it again in the recording, or anybody who's tuning in for the recording, you can pause and look at it a little more carefully. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. So just the caveat here. But today we're going to talk about raising truly healthy kids, the dirty truth. And just how we can really intentionally work to improve our children's and just generally children's health in our population today. And one of the best ways that I can think of to convey why this is so important to me is to just briefly share what made me so interested in this topic to begin with, and actually what pulled me into this field of functional medicine. So this sweet, very chunky monkey is my baby boy. He was born in 2011, and he was an elective C-section at 39 weeks and born at a whopping 8 pounds, 11 ounces. So he was not lacking for nutrition at that point. And it became very clear very early on that he was different than my other two kids. We were dealing with a lot of episodes of him waking up shortly after nursing, screaming and kind of writhing in pain. And after a few days, my sleep deprived brain finally put together, you know what, I think this is maybe reflux. And so brought him to the pediatrician, and he confirmed my suspicion. And we had a discussion, decided, okay, let's put him on Zantac and try to control it. Well, after titrating that dose up for a little period of time to the max dose at his weight class, we kind of got it under control. It wasn't perfect, but it was much better at least. And so that symptom was somewhat managed, but honestly, he stayed on Zantac for over a year. Every single time he gained weight, we had to move that dose up. So we had to keep him at that max dose per weight the entire time. And even though the reflux was somewhat better, other symptoms like diarrhea, spitting up, or actually really vomiting at times were coming up. He had some eczema issues. He was a colicky baby, until he was 6 or 7 months old. Neither of us were sleeping well. Things were not right. And this persisted for a long period of time, and we kept bringing him to different practitioners and specialists. We brought him to the allergist, who diagnosed him with strawberry, dairy, and egg allergy, but tested a bunch of other foods, said everything else is fine, you just need to remove those foods. We did that, nothing really got better. And finally, at about 12 months old, we brought him up to DeVos, to a gastroenterologist, and he scoped him, did an endoscope, and said everything looks perfect, and diagnosed him with failure to thrive at that point, because at that point, my original chunky monkey was now less than 1 percentile on the growth curve, and told me, I don't know what to tell you, everything looks fine. And he was one who kind of started this litany of kind of answers to our problems. And they're not really answers. He said, well, he'll probably just grow out of it. You just have to be patient. Other people would tell me, oh, this just maybe is normal. You may just have to get used to some of these things. And kind of my favorite was, well, you and your husband aren't very big people, so maybe he's just small, which after your kid has been diagnosed with failure to thrive is not exactly reassuring. And so at this point, this was when I was kind of shoved into trying to figure things out on my own and figure out where we head from here. This was in the midst of raising my other two children, and they were also dealing with their own normal health issues, right? My firstborn dealt with multiple ear infections back to back to back, to the point where we almost had to put tubes in. My middle child, pictured here, would have these episodes of eczema that were so flared it would become red and warm, almost painful to the touch sometimes. And we always had GI viruses run through our house, often multiple times during a season, as you know, many people do. And these were just kind of the normal issues that a lot of us with kids, especially in daycare, dealt with, right? These are just, what the kind of the name of the game when you have multiple children. But then as I started delving into the realm of functional medicine, and as I started doing more research, began to realize that, you know what, this shouldn't be our normal. This isn't normal, right? So doing a lot of research into this realm from a mental and psychological standpoint alone, in just the last 10 years, the number of children placed on some sort of stimulant or antipsychotics has tripled. The number, or the percentage of children aged 3 to 7 with any sort of developmental disability has doubled. The incidence of autism has increased by over 70%. And 11% of school-aged children and 20% of teens have a diagnosis of ADHD or ADD. That's just from a mental health standpoint alone. And then when we talk about some of the food allergies or general allergy asthma statistics, the Food Allergy Research Association has accumulated a lot of statistics and show that currently approximately 8% of children have some sort of food allergy. That's 1 in 13 children, or basically 2 children in every classroom, if you think about it from that perspective. The CDC has statistics showing that from 1997 to 2011, excuse me, there's been a 50% increase in food allergies in children. Especially prominent, we see peanut and tree nut allergies. And for those who were raised in the 80s and 90s like myself, that's a startling difference from my own personal perspective. When I was in grade school, in middle school, and high school, I don't know that I remember more than 1 or 2 kids with a food allergy. And now those of us with kids in schools, it is expected almost and normal for at least 1 or 2 children in each classroom to have allergies and have us have limitations in what products we can bring to school because of it. In addition to this, we're also seeing a significant increase in the number of diseases in children that we typically associate with adults or even more elderly adults. Type 2 diabetes was not even seen in the pediatric population prior to 1995. But from 2002 to 2012, there's been almost a 5% increase per year in the incidence of type 2 diabetes in children aged 10 to 19. Type 1 diabetes, insulin-dependent diabetes, has increased almost 2% annually for a several-year period of time. Almost 10% of adolescents have fatty liver disease. This is a disease where there's literally fat accumulation in the liver, and this is typically associated with older adults, patients who are dealing with some obesity issues, eat a largely processed food diet high in polyunsaturated or in saturated fats or synthetic fats and processed sugars. But this is rapidly increasing in the pediatric population. And also the incidence of autoimmune diseases throughout the world, and that's this graph shows, I mean, this is not just a United States issue. Throughout the world, the incidence of autoimmune disease is increasing annually in our pediatric population. So this new normal that we are all seeing generally in our pediatric population of multiple repeated ear infections that require higher and higher doses of antibiotics or stronger doses of antibiotics, frequent strep throat infections that are not adequately treated, but then also just these chronic symptoms, things like constipation and diarrhea, reflux, abdominal pain, nausea, allergies, eczema, and all of these symptoms lead to a daily or an almost daily use of medication, which once again, even 20 years ago, was not nearly as frequently seen. This is something that we associate, once again, with adulthood, but now we've got these children on 2, 3, 4 medications a day at this point. And I would argue, we would argue in functional medicine that instead of a new normal, that when our body exhibits these chronic symptoms like this, it's a sign from our own body that the system is under pressure, that something is not right. Our body gives these symptoms as a signal that we need to correct something. There's something out of balance. So really, that's the way I look at these symptoms that we're seeing in our youngest population. So what do we do to help these kids? I mean, we can continue to go the route that we often do, as parents and as pediatricians. We, treat the ear infections. We treat the constipation with Miralax. We give the antihistamines for, the allergic reactions. But really, even these tiny little human beings are incredibly complex creatures. And when we actually look at the root of these complex little systems, if we really try to balance that system, it's amazing how many other symptoms start to drift away and how much better the whole system works together. We're really trying to take a more complex look, but a more comprehensive look too, that solves many more issues than just one singular symptom or disease state. So really, in the end, we are what we take in, and that's often food related, what we're eating, but also what we're taking from a pill perspective or prescription perspective. What we're breathing in, that is also just as important, and that's assimilated through the respiratory tract. What we put on, so anything we put on our skin is incredibly absorptive. So anything we put on our skin has the risk and the chance of being brought into our system as well. And then also what we foster inside. And what I mean by that basically is what's inside the gut. And if any of you were at my first lecture, this slide might look familiar. spoiler alert, pretty much any presentation I give has this slide because it's important. But basically, once again, Hippocrates in about 400 BC was spot on, and all disease does begin in the gut, and specifically with relation to the problem that I'm discussing today, it's what's living inside of our gut that is absolutely crucial. So, as I said, I created this presentation a year ago. This slide takes on a whole new meaning in COVID territory right now. So I'm going to say that as kind of a caveat right now. These are interesting times, and I am not at all purporting that we stop cleaning everything and expose our body to any sort of germ. That's not what I would purport anyway. However, we have kind of reached a point in our society, even pre-COVID, when we have this gut feeling that keeping everything as clean and as sterile as possible is the best thing we can do to keep ourselves healthy, to keep ourselves safe, to keep our children safe. And this all stems, I'm going to go through a quick history lesson. This all stems from some amazing discoveries, some literally life-changing discoveries that were made over 200 years ago, almost 200 years ago. Prior to 1850, there was this belief that you got sick because of bad humors or bad luck, or maybe there was some religious reason why you were being punished, basically. But then Louis Pasteur came along and made the discovery that no, there were actually little microscopic noceums that were causing these diseases and illness. And that was groundbreaking in and of itself. And then 20 years later, Dr. Lister had the good fortune to realize, well, hey, if there are these little organisms that are causing things, maybe we as doctors and medical personnel should be washing our hands between seeing patients and maybe even sterilizing some equipment that we're using from patient to patient. And when they started instituting those policies, lo and behold, their patients were faring so much better. The mortality rate went way, way down. So this was groundbreaking and truly instrumental in changing our medical system. And then in 1942, a couple years after penicillin was accidentally discovered on a piece of bread, we ended up using it to treat bacterial infections. And this was kind of the second groundbreaking discovery and literally life-changing discovery in medicine. Now, what used to be a very simple but potentially very deadly infection is now often easily treated, rarely a blip on the radar screen, with an antibiotic of some sort. And these developments, as I said, have literally saved millions upon millions of lives, and Western medicine would not be where we are today without these discoveries. We have extended life expectancy superbly. However, just as with any good thing, there's always kind of a caveat or another side, right? And the concern with this, and the concern with going to the extreme with this, is not all bacteria are bad. We have germs, we have bacteria or viruses or funguses that are pathogens, meaning they cause damage, they cause disease. But we also conversely have the microbiome, and the microbiome are those beneficial bacteria, and that also includes viruses and fungi as well, but beneficial microorganisms that our body literally depends on for optimal health. And unfortunately, when we're implementing extreme sterilization or cleaning procedures, when we're using antibiotics kind of to the nth degree or for any possible disease or infection, as much as it's treating those bad bugs, we're also having some detrimental effect to those beneficial bugs as well. So why do we care about these bugs? What's the deal? First of all, just to kind of quantify, we have anywhere from 10 to 100 trillion bacteria on or in our human body. We've got bacteria on our skin, they're in our respiratory tract, in our GI tract, in our urinary tract. So there are at least 10 times more microorganisms in and on our bodies than actual cells in our own body. And this creates this teamwork, basically. These little guys are just as important as our own cellular structure. And the reason for that is because the bacteria literally communicate with individual cells, especially on the gut level, but it also communicates very intricately with the immune system and the nervous system. I'm going to talk about that more specifically in just a minute. And they also communicate with our genes. So there are certain bacterial communications or certain bacterial combinations that literally can turn genes on or off, or change the way that our genes are translated or used in our body. So these little guys govern a lot of how our body functions, and our body relies very, very heavily on a good combination, basically. So we've learned more and more about the microbiome, especially over the last 15 to 20 years or so. And after proceeding with a ton of these studies, a number of different organizations have kind of pulled together data and came up with the biodiversity hypothesis. And the World Allergy Organization in 2013 kind of put this in the most clear and concise statement. And it's a three-part hypothesis. First of all, that reduced biodiversity, meaning a decreased diversity of the microbes in our own bodies or on our skin. When we have a reduced diversity, it is associated with inflammatory conditions such as asthma, allergies, obesity, type 1 diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease. We tend to see a reduced biodiversity in populations who live in an urban setting in first world countries. Those populations are at the highest risk to have a reduced biodiversity, and that reduced biodiversity lends itself to be a risk factor for dysregulation of the immune system and an impaired tolerance, or basically more sensitivities, allergies, inflammatory responses, basically. And then they've done a number of studies, and they've repeated these over the years, of immigrant populations who have either moved from a third world country to a first world country, or even from a more rural population somewhere to a more urban setting. And that immune tolerance shifts very rapidly when they move from a microbial diverse area to an area of reduced microbial diversity. So what this shows is that when we change our exposure, this is changed. The diversity in our own body is changed. This is how reliant we are on our environment, basically. So what we want is exposure to nature. We want to be exposed to a rich assortment of bacteria, of microbes, of those crucial, the crucial diversity that our body needs. These little kids are doing exactly what they need to do, despite their mother's dispute. So what exactly is the reason, especially in our peds population, that I'm so concerned about the microbiome? Our immune system needs to be trained. If you think about our immune system as a military, as part of the Army or the Navy, our military goes through basic training. It goes through Navy SEAL training, all of those highly technical, highly specialized training programs, so that they can learn how to react to certain situations in a relatively safe environment, so that when something really goes wrong, they are highly trained and ready to respond optimally. It is no different with our immune system. And the prime time when this occurs is especially from birth to about age 36 months, because this is the time when our little bodies are changing, they're growing. The bacterial diversity is growing rapidly as we're increasing our exposure to our environment. We're crawling around, and then we're running and walking around. We're increasing our food exposure. And so these microbes are growing and diversifying and changing. And that whole time, our immune system is doing the exact same thing. And when we've got a good synchrony, the good beneficial bacteria talk and work very closely with the immune system to help teach tolerance, to help train, okay, so this peanut, this is okay, you don't need to react, versus this streptococcus bacteria, this is not so good. Maybe you need to learn how to create a little bit of an immune response. So this is a very tight association. And when the bacterial diversity is lower, this training program tends to go awry. Then we tend to develop more of a pro-inflammatory state because the immune system is confused and it hasn't been trained appropriately. And then we potentially have a dangerous situation and it doesn't really know because it hasn't been trained. So maybe we should just mount a response. This is in a very intricate dance. And this is why we're so concerned about the quality and the diversity of that microbiome and the interaction with the immune system, because all of this training at this period of time really sets up our immune system's response for the rest of our lifetime. In addition, the gut is also literally tied to the brain via the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, that extends down from the brainstem through the chest cavity and all the way into the gut. And it innervates our heart and lungs and abdominal organs, but it also serves as a very rapid highway system. And the immune system, or the immune cells, can travel very quickly up and down this highway, communicating any sort of inflammatory concern from the gut directly up to the brain. As I talked about once again at our last lecture, just in case you did see it, otherwise you can kind of refer back to that too. But when we have inflammation in the gut, there are signals like cytokines that will shoot up toward the brain and signal the immune cells in the brain, there's a danger, you need to kind of heighten your response. Usually, if this inflammatory signaling is short-lived, the increased inflammation in the brain will change the way the brain fires, but for a short time. And then as things calm down, things generally, calm down in the brain as well, and normal brain function resumes. When this is a more chronic inflammatory picture, the immune cells in the brain set up more of a chronic inflammatory system as well. And this switch gets turned on more regularly. The switch is harder actually to turn off at that point because it's kind of in this danger mode now, and it's set at more of a pro-inflammatory state. And this is where we can see gut issues lead to effects on our ability to learn, our ability to retain or develop memories, our ability to sleep, all of those neurologic associations. In addition to the fact that our microbes in our gut also develop about 80% of the serotonin, or the feel-good happy hormone, in our gut as well. So neurotransmitter development is also very tightly tied. And those neurotransmitters are essential for that positive mood. So how do we try to foster these beneficial bacteria in kids and honestly in adults as well? And one of the best ways is to get dirty, literally. It's just to increase our exposure to nature as much as possible. And I'm not saying you have to roll around in a mud puddle and get completely covered necessarily, but there's so many reasons why we need to get our kids away from screens and outdoors anyway. And like I said, I can't address all of the reasons for this, but one huge reason is to really expose our bodies to these natural microbes. Evolutionarily, the way we got many of those microbes was from interacting with nature. We weren't stuck in buildings, we weren't stuck in schools, we weren't stuck in offices. We were outside, and that's how we assimilated most of those. This also includes, eating vegetables fresh from the garden, just any way that we can expose ourselves to those good natural elements. And just, aside from the distinct microbes that we can get from nature, there are a number of studies that confirm kids who spend more time outside do have increased attention spans. They have literally better test performance, improved immunity, as we discussed. There's a very clear association there, and just more calm and happier kids. So this is one of the best things we can do. Another thing that we have some concerns about generally is just being careful about our exposure to antibiotics. And once again, I am not saying that there aren't times and reasons to give antibiotics. They are life-saving. But we also have to understand that with that benefit of killing that pathogenic microbe, we also have an impact on the gut. And that impact can be somewhat long lasting, especially if we don't do something to help reculture that positive beneficial blend. So it's just thinking twice before we throw an antibiotic at absolutely anything, that looks at all red and angry. Ear infections, we're learning are often more virally mediated. So it's just, kind of having a little bit of a careful approach to how often we use antibiotics, especially in our young ones, because that's when the microbiome is growing and building so rapidly. And even one course of antibiotics can just completely diminish that significantly. We do see through a number of different studies that when we overuse antibiotics, there's definitely an association with increased risk of obesity, increased risk of allergies, and then downstream increased risk of autoimmune disease. And it's directly, at least partly directly, due to that alteration of the microbiome itself. And then once again, COVID notwithstanding, these are interesting times, but generally cleaner is not always better. It's not to say that we don't want to keep things somewhat clean, and I will fully admit that when I go to Meijer, I take one of those wipes and wipe down the handle because there are so many people that are touching that and ill. But I don't sterilize everything, and I think we need to be very careful about making sure that we don't keep everything sterile. In addition to needing exposure to the beneficial bacteria in nature, once again, our immune system needs to be trained. And especially kids' immune systems need to be trained. So we need that minimal exposure to even the pathogenic bacteria and viruses so that the immune system can see a safer amount, realize, oh yeah, that's not so good, and mount a response and create those antibodies or those memory cells that then the next time we get an exposure, and maybe even a larger, more dangerous exposure, the immune system is trained right away and knows exactly how to respond. So this is where we need to find that balance of having that minimal exposure and allowing that immune system to be trained and optimized and still keeping somewhat safe. And this is something even in COVID territory, I'm still somewhat concerned with. I want to make sure I don't keep everything super sterile. So along the lines of cleaning, we'll kind of move on to the next aspect of this. As I said, we are also what we put on our skin and or what we breathe in. And one of the aspects that that we see with our kids, and some of the reasons that we're seeing some trends in our pediatric population, is because of the increase in chemicals or the change in chemicals that we're using in some of our cleaning products and some of our personal care products, those sorts of things. This is a whole nother lecture, a whole nother topic, a whole nother series in and of itself. But what I always refer patients to generally is the Environmental Working Group's website, ewg.org. You can search, as it says here, they've got, every year they update their guide to sunscreens, but they've got cleaning products, they've got lotions, they've got makeup. Pretty much anything that you can think of that you either put on your body or use in your household is listed and graded on this website. And all of the grades are based on research and studies linking certain chemicals or certain ingredients to an increased association or risk for certain disease states, for allergic reactions, for even increased risk or increased incidence of cancer. So it grades these products from basically an A to an F. It's very hard actually for a product to get an A on this site, but generally if I can find one that's a B or even a high C, I feel generally decent about it. Obviously I try to go with as high a grade as possible, but this is an incredibly good resource when I'm looking at, what can I use safely in my household and with my family. Generally, some of the chemicals that we see and that we have some concern with, especially with our pediatric population, and once again, this list could be forever long, but a few key ones that we deal with. Phthalates and parabens specifically are in a number of lotions, shampoos and conditioners, even some soaps. These are linked with hormone disruption, especially in our female population. Phthalates specifically have a fair amount of research linking phthalate exposure with increased incidence of early puberty, which we're seeing more and more in our pediatric population. So these are components that, I'm really kind of mindful of with, especially, my girls at home, but also generally with my female patients. Anything that you're using on a regular basis, especially, really try to find products that don't have these components in it. And you're going to find more and more on the shelves that specifically advertise that they don't have these, because there's more demand for this. Ethylene oxide also has some hormone disruption properties. Lead, so we saw with the Flint water crisis alone over the last couple of years, but the effects of lead alone on the brain is huge. And obviously, the lead that we're going to find in makeup products or that sort of thing is not going to be near the levels that we, saw over in Flint. But even small amounts, especially when it's teamed up with other toxicity from other components, can still lead to some dysfunction. So that's a concern in some makeup products, especially, once again, for our teenage girls. And then triclosan is an antibacterial, but initially it was developed as a pesticide. And that has been linked to some fairly serious thyroid hormone dysregulation in some patient populations. That's actually harder to find in products anymore because there was such a fight back, but you can still see it in some toothpaste, some soaps. So that's another ingredient that, generally we want to try to avoid in large quantities. And this kind of brings up, I have a fair number of patients who, will say, well, Carrie, how much is too much? Or, I looked at this ingredients list and phthalate is way at the bottom, which means there's not much. So do I really have to worry about it? And my argument, especially with the pediatric population, is, yeah, it's possible that we don't necessarily see a huge link with a small amount of chemical in one product in a patient population. But first of all, with our little kids, dose matters. So because a certain amount of chemical doesn't affect an adult population, can we still guarantee that in a 30-pound toddler, it's not going to cause a problem? We have different doses of acetaminophen or Tylenol for adults versus teenage kids versus infants, because that dose matters. And there's arguably the same concern with some of these chemicals, because it's shown it's safe in adults. Does that still mean that it's not affecting our kids differently? And they're not running experiments on kids because it's not ethical. I mean, it's not a good idea. So this is part of my concern. Another concern is that we all have different genetic makeup, and genetics determine a lot of different things, but one thing it really determines is how well our body can kick out certain chemicals that we're exposed to. Our body is always detoxing, always kicking out some stuff through the liver, through the kidneys. But we all have different genetic makeups that change that a little bit. One good example is how your body reacts to caffeine. Some of us can drink caffeine at 9 p.m. and go to sleep at 10 and sleep soundly. Others can't drink a drop of caffeine after 11 a.m., otherwise they can't sleep. And one component that really controls that is literally a specific genetic SNP or a genetic variant that is different in some of us. So it's the same way with some of these toxins. Some of us are really efficient at being exposed to a chemical that may not be ideal, but we can get it out of our body and it's not a big deal. Others, we struggle a little bit more. So, and this is something that, we're not wearing signs on our chest telling us whether or not we can detox well. And then previous exposures matter. And once again, just because there's a small amount in one product that doesn't, there's a small amount of phthalate in one product, and so that's not a big deal. But if you're applying this product on a daily basis to a kid who has lead toxicity in Flint, who's already dealing with a toxic picture, it might be a different situation. So when you accumulate all of these different exposures over time and through different mechanisms, that buildup can really cause an issue as well. So the take-home message that I tell all of my patients, but especially the parents of my peds patients too, is, do I worry about absolutely every little thing that I put on my kids at all times? No, I don't hyperanalyze everything. What I am very careful about are things that I use on a daily basis and or even like a weekly basis. I'm pretty careful about what ingredients are in it and trying to reduce that exposure, so that the few random times that we go to a friend's house and use their sunscreen, maybe it's not ideal, but that minimal exposure is not going to add up, you know, with everything else that I've been exposing my child to. I hope that makes sense. So now we talked about what we put in our body and or what we breathe in. We talked about what we're fostering inside of our body, but then what we're putting in our body. And this is food, and food matters significantly. And the standard American today eats at least 60% of processed foods, and that means foods that are high in processed oils, sweeteners, whether they're natural or artificial, refined grains, very little fiber. And a lot of these processed foods also have a bunch of other additives, chemicals, you know, all sorts of other things to make it more appealing, to make it more flavorful, to make them last longer. And it's these sorts of chemicals and components that there are some concerns about, in addition to the processed oils and processed sugars. And this too could be a lecture that could go on for quite a while, but I just want to draw attention to a few key major issues. And then if anyone has any questions, feel free to shoot them to me. So food dye specifically, if you don't personally have an experience with a child or grandchild who you feel might react to food dyes, I'm sure you've heard of somebody who does insist that, you know, when my child has something that's red, they go crazy. Well, there's actually research to back that up. So there was initially studies done as early as 1975 that associated artificial food dyes with an increased risk for ADHD. Subsequently, in 2007 and 2010, there was a university out in the United Kingdom that did a vast amount of research, really looking very closely at this association. And they supported this assertion that, you know, the exposure of artificial food dyes is linked quite tightly with an increased risk for ADHD. Well, this hit the news. FDA came out with a statement very shortly thereafter, basically saying, maybe in certain susceptible kids who already have ADHD, it might be an issue, but really we just don't see a clear association. The European Union saw that same bit of research and said, that's it, we're taking all synthetic food dyes out of foods that young children are going to be eating. And I saw this actually firsthand. My family traveled to Ireland a couple of years ago, and my kids ran up to me at a festival with a package of Starburst that looked exactly like ours from home and said, can I buy it? Can I buy it? And I'm a little bit of a food Nazi, so I rolled my eyes and was ready to spit out no, and then turned over the package, as I always do. I always label read anything to remind myself basically how bad it is. And if you look at these two labels, the one on the right was the one that I saw. So basically no corn syrup, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, but is one huge concern that I have. And then instead of using artificial food dyes, they use all food-based food dyes. And I was shocked, and then I was happy, because at that point I was happy to let my kids enjoy a small treat and really, you know, cherish it. And then I was mad because this package looks exactly the same on the outside as ours does in the United States. And why are we going to the extremes of making two different types of products to market to two different communities? Yeah, when the kids opened up the candy, it wasn't as vibrantly neon colored as ours are in the United States, but my kids still definitely enjoyed it just as much. So this is how it's played out. Instead, the FDA did release a statement saying, you know, given the research that we see, we do recommend that we should try to reduce consumption of food dyes to 30 milligrams per day. That's nice to think about, except when we look at serving sizes for some of these products here, just one serving size alone exceeds what the FDA says we should have on a daily basis. And it's even found in some fairly unassuming products like mac and cheese. Dill pickles have green and yellow food dye in them often if you don't get a more natural product. Dill relish, mustard. There are so many products that you just don't even think about that have food dyes in them. And so it's very easy to see how this can accumulate rapidly without even really thinking about it or, you know, or processing it. Another component that's somewhat concerning is MSG. Monosodium glutamate is MSG, and it's put in many foods to help enhance flavor. It also, works somewhat as a preservative, but it's mainly found in any food that has a flavor packet, any food that has a processed cheesy flavor, because it really does enhance flavor. It also stimulates appetite. So food companies have another reason to put it in, because it really helps to basically encourage overeating. You're craving more and more. It works almost as a drug. Therefore, it can lead to weight gain, some appetite dysregulation. But then glutamate itself is one of those molecules that can cross that blood-brain barrier, that protective mechanism that protects our brain from many different components. The glutamate easily crosses through that and is an excitatory protein. It really turns on signals and helps to stimulate. And in many cases, that can kind of go awry. There are a number of patients that link increased headaches or increased pain generally with eating MSG, agitation for sure, sometimes difficulty sleeping. There are even some studies that link MSG exposure with seizures. And this is an ingredient that's sometimes hard to suss out, and this is true with several different components. Unfortunately, labeling is not exactly clear. So on this list, there are ingredients that basically always contain MSG, but you can see, except for the literal monosodium glutamate, all of them look a little bit different. And then there are other ingredients that may contain MSG, we don't know. And a lot of these ingredients you'll see on a number of different labels. So sometimes it's hard to really discern, is this product safe? Is it not? And there are once again, a number of other components that, are somewhat concerning. These are just a couple others. Brominated vegetable oil, BVO, was actually developed to help keep plastics from burning, but then they discovered that it also helps keep food coloring and liquid from separating. So this is something that we see in Mountain Dew, sometimes in some Powerades, orange sodas. BHT and BHA are preservatives, but those also have been linked to some endocrine disruption. There's also some concern, a few studies that have linked an increased incidence of cancer with significant ingestion of these products. These can also be in some beauty products as well. So just, some other chemicals that, really pervade our food system and we just don't think about or don't realize we're ingesting, but can potentially have some fairly detrimental responses. And once again, just showing that there are a number of links to some of these food additives and hyperactivity in children, and the association has been proven time and again. And then the most addicting drug, sugar. And sugar, even in its natural form, is still incredibly high in calories and incredibly low in nutrition, and incredibly addictive. Sugar works on the morphine receptor in our brain, and it is just basically as powerful as morphine or cocaine on that receptor. So once our brain starts getting it, it just wants more. And once again, unfortunately, food companies know that. Adolescents today get at least 40% of their calories generally from sugar. This has been leading to that fatty liver episodes that we're seeing, the increased incidence of type 2 diabetes, and also some of those neurologic disturbances that we're seeing. Interestingly enough, the amount of sugar in one can of Pepsi equals the amount of sugar that the population in 1910 would get in 5 days. So, and that's just one can of pop. That's how much our sugar intake has increased over this last century, basically. It's just incredible. And unfortunately, sugar hides in a number of different foods that otherwise we really think are relatively healthy. The American Heart Association in 2009 recommended, okay, adults, we shouldn't ingest any more than 5 to 9 teaspoons per day. Well, that, depending on the type of Coke, I think that literally is tied to a flavored Coke. But still, that can literally mean a half of a 12-ounce Coke, sometimes, a cup of Jell-O or even a half of a cup of Jell-O. There are a number of granola bars that really are purported to be healthy that can have incredible amounts of added sugar. Yogurt products, especially commercial yogurt products or products geared toward kids with food dyes and sugars. So this is something that we really have to be very aware of in order to really reduce our sugar intake. And once again, there are a number of different ways that we can label sugar. So we really have to be cognizant for looking for these specific additives. And this is another one, could be another lecture. I'm really going to kind of skim over this, except to say high fructose corn syrup has replaced true sugar in a number of different products. And high fructose corn syrup is 10 times worse. It bypasses the liver and is directly metabolized into fat. It helps to promote further dysregulation of appetite because it doesn't provide that sense of fullness that even a standard table sugar does. There are a lot of reasons why, once again, food companies have gravitated toward this. It's much cheaper. Corn is very cheap. But it also really kind of propagates this continued food addiction scenario. This is something that I absolutely try to avoid in as many food products as possible. But in the end, really, the biggest benefit we can attain is to try to reduce as many food labels as we have to evaluate and move from food product to actual real food. That's the easiest way to really help promote optimal health. And it's true, truly let food be your medicine and medicine be your food, because when we truly eat what Mother Nature gives us, it provides not only those vitamins and minerals, but other essential elements that truly promote optimal health. And so then this is the million-dollar question, right? This is what patients come to me and say, okay, so what do I eat, Care? I just have no idea. And there is no global statement. We are all individuals. We all have specific needs. We all have specific exposures and histories. And we all want what's best for our kids, and that's going to look different for every single kid. But really, in the end, the one clear answer is, as much as we can focus on real food, the better we're going to be. So food nourishes not only our bodies, but also, back to that microbiome, those good bacteria inside of our gut. So one of the reasons that we really want to focus on as many plant-based or nature-based ingredients is because, in addition to giving us the nutrition, it feeds those good bacteria and really helps them grow and flourish. Prebiotics specifically are different types of fiber in these foods that help to feed those bacteria and promote those beneficial combinations. So, trying to increase as many of these foods as possible is definitely one aspect of promoting good health. But then also, in addition to plant-based foods providing optimal vitamins and minerals, they provide these phytonutrients as well. And this slide was also in my immune lecture, but phytonutrients are things like lycopene, resveratrol, quercetin, lutein, different plant-made nutrients that help heal, basically. Quercetin is a very powerful antihistamine. Elderberry has a number of different components that make it an incredibly potent antiviral. Garlic specifically is a very potent antibacterial. ECGC really helps to calm the brain. So all of these nutrients almost serve as a medicine or a soother to help calm the system. The one thing we do need to be concerned about, though, even with eating whole foods, is that food can also be a carrier of other unintended components. When we talk about animal-based products, just like we are what we eat, so are the sweet animals we ingest. So if, the burger that we're eating, if the cow was fed a bunch of antibiotics and given a ton of hormones and fed pesticide-laden feed, the product that we're eating has a lot less nutrient value and actually can convey some of those chemicals to us as well. When we talk about pesticides and herbicides, there's a lot of literature that links some cellular damage, or with glyphosate specifically, has even been linked to certain types of cancer. But pesticides and herbicides also, when they're sprayed on our crops, can actually bind nutrients from our soil and from the plants. So then the actual plant that we're ingesting, even if we're carefully washing all of those herbicides off, is less nutrient dense. It has less of those vitamins and minerals in it. And then genetically modified food. So once again, whole nother lecture. And the one caveat I'm going to say is there is just as much research to say that genetically modified foods are safe as there is research to say that genetically modified foods are unsafe, which means the science is not settled. I am not saying that genetically modified foods are not safe. I just can't guarantee that they are either. And one concern I have with genetically modified foods is that it has pervaded so much of our food system that the dose, once again, that generally we're getting if we're not really watching is incredibly high. And when I don't have settled science on whether this is perfectly safe, I don't necessarily want to have a high dose of said item. So I generally counsel my patients, just be careful, be mindful. Do you have to avoid it completely? Not necessarily, but there's definitely some concern in some studies that are linking an increased risk of obesity and other food intolerances with these products. So it's something to be aware of. Similarly, organic food. About a year ago when I made this presentation, it was shortly after there was this huge news report saying that organic foods are no more healthy than other foods, and really we should just be ditching this. It's nothing to be concerned about. And some of the statements that they made, one was that even organic food has pesticide on it. And it's true. Unfortunately, our water sources, our soil is so pervaded with these pesticides and herbicides generally that it's almost impossible to get a product without any of it on. But organic produce generally has a significantly reduced exposure. And once again, there are a number of studies that link significant pesticide exposure in children with a 2 times likelihood of being diagnosed with ADHD. There's also a number of herbicides specifically that are linked with endocrine disruption or hormone disruption, so increased obesity, increased incidence of early puberty. And we see when we shift from a standard produce to a more organic produce, when they ran a number of studies and tested these patients before and after, the number of metabolites from these pesticides being excreted from the body dramatically dropped within a few days. So if you've been eating standard produce, for 40 years, making the shift now will still have a substantial impact, and especially on our kids. Also, stressed plants make more phytonutrients. It's kind of their immune system of sorts. So just like our immune system needs that stimulation to really be trained and at optimal support, produce needs to have a little exposure to pests and to fungus and all of those things, because then the plant mounts a response by increasing nutrition value, increasing phytonutrient value. So there truly is, and maybe not always astronomical, but there is an increased nutrient value when those plants are forced to kind of thrive on their own a little bit. So we talked about the importance of getting outside with our kids, really having that exposure to nature to really foster that good microbiome, because that microbiome is crucial to maintaining a healthy immune system and maintaining a healthy brain. And part of maintaining that healthy microbiome is also then being cognizant and aware of what antibiotic prescriptions, what other prescriptions we're putting in our bodies. But then another aspect is just to try to be aware of what chemicals we're using, what lotions and body products we're using, not being overly anxious about it, but being aware. And then the importance of food and really trying to increase as many whole foods-based products as possible with our children. And really, I always tell my parents it's hard to make these changes, especially if you're truly in fairly a standard process where you're just trying to move from day to day and getting the convenient foods that your kids are going to like. And I was there. I was there. But it's finding the reason for change. And this little monkey is now the little boy that was diagnosed failure to thrive. And he is truly thriving now. But as hard as it is sometimes to make these changes, to see the difference in your family just makes it all worth it. So that's it. I'm 5 minutes over. That's
You
not
did
too bad.
great. Awesome. Well, a couple questions. So we
Sure.
had a question about the adult immune system versus kind of the kid immune system. And so
Mhm.
wanting to know, is the adult immune system able to be enhanced or retrained in some of the language that you were using?
Yes, absolutely. It gets so from 0 to 36 months, the microbiome is incredibly malleable. It's really fluid and can shift rapidly. Once we hit about 3 to 4 years old, that microbiome, and I kind of discussed this last time too, but that microbiome grows into this thick biofilm, this gelatinous kind of goo that settles in our gut and is harder to adjust, but it still absolutely can be. So what we can do to help improve our immune system or improve the microbiome as an adult are doing things like removing inflammatory foods, trying to increase nutrients like glutamine, like omega-3, taking a good quality probiotic, and or sometimes more importantly, eating probiotic foods and beverages, eating those prebiotic foods, those sorts of things. And I've even noticed in my own population too, my peds population shift and improve so much faster because they're so much more resilient, right? And that tissue is young, they bounce back so quickly. But we absolutely make huge changes in adults as well. It just often takes a little more time, a little more work. We have a little more history. There's more exposure. There's more that we have to work with, but we absolutely can continue to make changes. And I have seen adults get rid of food allergies or food sensitivities over time. We just have to retrain. We have to calm down that immune system response, and then we have to retrain it that this is okay. This is still not, but this is okay. And now we can eat it and it's just fine. So it's just a little more complicated, but absolutely doable.
Awesome. And then I know a hot topic I hear a lot from parents that I work with is about dairy. Now, I know we don't have a ton of time to talk about dairy, but there is some question, especially in the kid aspect,
Yeah. Yeah.
about dairy. And so just thinking on that, let's say birth to 36 months and then 36 months to like preteen, so like 12.
Yes.
Do you have any global considerations, maybe not recommendations, but considerations that you discuss with parents?
Absolutely. So dairy, especially with the little ones, anytime I have a patient who has a fairly significant amount of eczema and or constipation, dairy is one of the first triggers that I look for, and we try to remove. So it absolutely can be one of the more inflammatory foods that we deal with. With that said, dairy specifically is also one of those components where quality matters. And once again, when we're buying the cheapest gallon of milk that we can at Meijer, we are getting milk from a cow that has probably been given some form of hormones, antibiotics, and fed who knows what. And then we are getting those proteins through in the milk, just like our infants get what we're eating when we're nursing, right? So quality is also crucial. And I have seen patients who were unable to tolerate conventional dairy move to a grass-fed product from a cow that's, raised and fed what it really should be eating evolutionarily, and their tolerance is a much different picture. Same idea. So with teenagers, especially when we're dealing with a lot of acne issues, sometimes dairy is one of the first things we end up pulling. Same idea, constipation and or diarrhea. Then sometimes there's a question of lactose versus casein sensitivity too. I mean, this is where it gets really, really complicated. But in the end, globally, I do absolutely advocate being very careful about the quality of the product that you're using, because it's amazing how much we can tolerate when we really move away from, sorry, Yoplait yogurt versus something that doesn't have food colorings and a whole bunch of artificial sugars and is derived from a truly healthy animal.
That makes total sense. That makes total sense. No, this has just been fabulous. So I think that is just wonderful information for everybody to learn about, not just for the kiddos, but for yourself and for everybody, because we have some significant opportunities every time we go to the store to make different choices, right? And so if you're struggling with inflammatory symptoms, just like Carrie was talking about, some of this is within our scope to try to figure out, right? And obviously there's professionals for sure. Carrie's amazing, but at least when you go to the store, realize you have a choice. We have choices. I mean, literally right next to each other, you have a choice between an organic strawberry and a non-organic strawberry, or that organic milk or that non-organic milk. And so that right there can be just in that moment of whether you reach 2 inches to the right or 2 inches to the left, and you can empower yourself and your kiddos to make some of these small changes that really can compound. One question more before we go: is the USDA a reliable tag to look for quality?
Sometimes. Not not necessarily. What I often recommend, if you're trying to avoid GMOs, the USDA does not necessarily recognize that. So then you're looking for a non-GMO. Often it'll say non-GMO project or non-GMO product. If it says non-GMO, that doesn't still necessarily mean that it's organic. Those are two different things. So, there are different associations that you're trying to look for, but looking for something specifically that says non-GMO is going to rule out those genetically modified products. Looking for something organic means that there are certain regulations that they have adhered to make sure that the pesticide and herbicide exposure is as low as possible. So those are kind of the two keys that I can think of off the top of my head to really keep an eye out for.
Mm-hmm. One more question. Somebody had a question regarding dairy milk versus almond milk products. And I don't know if you have any comments on that.
So yeah, I mean, there are almond milk products, there are rice milk, oat milk, coconut milk, cashew milk. Those products are something that I will refer my patients to who, I'm trying to determine if they have a dairy sensitivity or I know they have a dairy sensitivity. They're great products. You just need to be aware they're not going to give you vitamin D. They're not going to give you calcium, at least not in the quantity that you get in a dairy product. And some of them have some gums or fillers that in some of my really sensitive patients can also set off a reaction. So, So there's no, once again, this is where, every patient is different. We have almond milk at home and, we use it for a lot of different things, but I also make sure that I supplement with other food products to get calcium in, to get vitamin D in. So it's just knowing your product and realizing early on when I was dealing with Graham, before I knew all of this, when he was dairy allergic, I switched to coconut milk and I had the pediatric GI say, hey, that is not a replacement for the formula that you were giving him. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. So you have to definitely think through some of those nutrient components. It's, when milk does not equate another. With that said, it, very well could be tolerated well. You just have to be aware of what you're missing.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Carrie, for fabulous information. This will be, like we talked about, recorded and posted on our website. We'll post the replay up to Facebook. Make sure we get this information out. And for those of you watching the replay and for those of you here with us live, we will be doing another webinar with Dr. Chad Thorpe about head and neck pain, breathing, and sleep disorders. It's going to be wonderful. You won't want to miss that one either. We got one more chat coming in. Oh, it just says great, very informative. Lots of wonderful feedback for Carrie. So thank you everybody again. It's just fabulous to have this information out and available so that people can start making good choices for you and for your kiddos. So thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful day. And as always, we love you more than you know. Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Carrie. Thanks, Ellen and Jeremy.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Joe.